You're listening to World Class from the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. We bring expertise on international affairs from Stanford's campus straight to you. I'm Michael McFaul, the host of World Class and director of the Freeman Spogli Institute. My guest today is Brett McGurk. Thanks for being here, Brett.
It's great to be here, Mike.
He is our Payne Distinguished Lecturer at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, which is one of the centers affiliated with FSI. Before coming to Stanford, he served as Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS at the U.S. Department of State, where he helped to build and then lead the coalition in the global campaign against ISIS. Brett's research interests center on national security, strategy, and diplomacy, and you may have seen him interviewed on television or quoted many times, as you are really in high demand these days, Brett. All the more so that we need to thank you for taking time to be here on World Class. Sure. Let's start from the very beginning. Why were we in Syria in the first place? I mean, tell us about the coalition you put together. Tell us what we were doing in response to what happened there with ISIS.
So, first, great to be here. I just coming from just upstairs, so it's great to just walk down and see you here in your office. So, when I got into this on the Syria part, you really have to go back to the summer of 2014. And this was when ISIS, it's really extraordinary if you go back to that time, a terrorist entity controlled basically a state of 8 million people in Iraq and Syria. They had revenues of $1 billion a year.
They came out of Iraq, right?
So it's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which came out of the Iraq War, led by Zarqawi, who was kind of the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who kind of fought U.S. forces almost to a standstill until we did the surge, where President Bush sent 30,000 more forces into Iraq with a new strategy. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, in the cauldron of the Syrian civil war, as kind of the Syrian state began to erode, migrated to Syria and regenerated. First, they were known as the Nusra Front, and then there was a split. Basically, Baghdadi and other elements of the kind of Al-Qaeda circle.
Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS,
who we just killed, which was great news. It was Landmark Day.
We'll come back to him in a minute.
There was a debate about what should our strategy be, and classic Al-Qaeda thinking is we should be clandestine, cellular, but Baghdadi, taking the strategy from Zarqawi from 2004, and we intercepted at the time letters between Zarqawi and Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. It was their strategy to actually establish a caliphate, a state, which, sounded somewhat delusional when they were having these debates. But Baghdadi determined that because of what was going on in Syria, that they could actually pull this off.
Because the Syrian government was so weak, and they were in reaction to the Arab
Syrian government
Spring
has eroded. There's kind of the state control is eroding. Kind of a state of anarchy developing. Frankly, you had, really starting in 2012, 2013, just thousands of foreign extremist fighters pouring into Syria, looking for extremist groups to join. Baghdadi's guys, which became ISIS, basically took advantage of this.
Right.
And they started to take territory and control territory and govern under the most ruthless interpretation of Islamic law, and then migrated back into Iraq. And so this started to develop in 2013. Suicide bombings in Iraq, which are like 5 a month or so, started to go up to 30, 40, 50 a month. And that started to tell me, working the Iraq file, which was extremely difficult, that we have an industrial strength problem on our hands, because suicide bombers are mostly not Iraqis, they're foreign fighters.
Interesting.
And if you have that pipeline, you have something pretty serious. To get someone recruited into Syria, into the pipeline, to then go blow himself up at a kid's soccer game, at an ice cream shop. That was happening in 2013 into 2014. New Year's Day 2014, frankly, before there was a lot of attention paid to this.
Where were you that day?
I was in Washington, but Fallujah fell to ISIS. Fallujah's a city which is well known because the U.S. Marines fought in Fallujah many times. We lost a lot of brave Americans there. ISIS controls Fallujah, about 40 kilometers or so west of Baghdad.
Right.
That's on New Year's Day 2013. I thought we had a very serious problem here. I actually testified before Congress in the fall of 2013 about Baghdadi and ISIS. Then the summer 2014, Mosul falls, and basically now ISIS controls basically a state. They really carved out. This is Baghdadi's dream, and he then goes to a famous mosque in Mosul and declares a caliphate. And that really galvanized tens of thousands of people to pour into Syria to be part of this historic, what he said was a historic moment in history.
Right. And so it was your job. It was Operation Inherent Resolve, right?
That was a military name for that.
That was the military side. The political side is called the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. So you were the political arm of the military operation, right? So tell us what happened after that.
So you worked closely with President Obama. So we had a debate starting in the summer of 2014, obviously a very serious debate. What do we do about this?
Right.
And there has to be military dimension to our campaign. I was very early advocate that we need military force almost immediately because you had a psychological collapse, particularly in Iraq. Obama was pretty clear that before we kind of crossed that Rubicon, we had to have a number of elements in place. Number one, he wanted to have a very broad coalition, so this isn't just the United States.
Right.
Second, he wanted to have a military campaign that was not based upon American forces going in and doing the fighting in Iraqi and Syrian streets and cities and alleys and valleys. It was going to be something called by, with, and through. We'll work with local partners.
Okay.
Third, he wanted the coalition to share the burdens and costs and everything else, and he wanted an Iraqi government that we could really rally behind because that would be the traction for us to be able to do this.
Right.
So we started to put that together over the summer, and the military campaign launched, I think, in the third week of August or so.
Uh-huh.
And it was a real war. I mean, a very difficult town-by-town struggle.
But successful war, right? I mean, continued under the Trump administration, as you also continued under the Trump administration. Tell us the change in administration. Did the effort, either the diplomatic or military, change? Or?
So it was interesting there. Was President Trump ran, he used to say, I have a secret plan for ISIS. When he was on the campaign trail, he had a secret plan, and he was complaining about Obama's generals and everything. So when he won the election, which I don't think they fully anticipated, actually. It was not a normal transition in which you're engaged with an incoming administration. But I got a phone call from Mike Flynn about 10 days or so before the inauguration.
The first national security advisor.
Incoming national security advisor.
Oh, the incoming, right, even before he got there.
Right. So this is before the actual switch. President Obama had asked if I'd be interested in staying on because we wanted to have some continuity.
Sure.
And our military side was staying on board, and I think the military folks also wanted me to stay for continuity. And I met with Flynn. I had a very good, detailed meeting of kind of where we stood on the campaign. Some things we could do differently. We had a meeting with President Obama just 3 days before the inauguration about, here are 5 decisions we need on the campaign, given where we were. Mm-hmm. And actually, we were in a decent place. We were about 30 kilometers north of Raqqa,
which was the
capital of ISIS.
Right.
The Battle of Mosul was about halfway through. So we had a lot of momentum. But we needed to adjust some things, and we passed all that off to the incoming Trump administration. And honestly, on this issue, it was, in my view, fairly professionally run. Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson, myself, we ran a strategic review of the entire campaign with the whole interagency, as you would be very familiar with.
Yep.
And the determination was that the campaign design was right, that the strategy was right. It needed some adjustments to speed some things up. One of those was we had to arm the Syrian Kurds, which we actually had not done yet,
at that point,
to take Raqqa.
Right.
So that's an interesting story. I'll just stop here. One question that went to President Trump by the time we did the strategic review was how to take Raqqa. This was a difficult question because Raqqa is the capital of ISIS. It's where major threats are emerging against us, against Europe. And we basically had 2 options. One, we could arm the Syrian Kurds, which we had been doing, so that they would take Raqqa. That would not require many more American forces. But we also worked very closely with Turkey to try to develop an option that they would like and that they would approve. And so we sent our best military planners there and presented President Trump with 2 options. Option 1, arm the Kurds, not require many more U.S. forces, very low risk for U.S. forces. Second, with Turkey, the plan that developed would have required almost 15,000 American troops and all sorts of other things. And so President Trump made the decision in May, arm the Kurds and take Raqqa. So bottom line, the transition on this issue was handled pretty well.
Right.
And we executed the plan, finished with Raqqa. Then things didn't really stay linear.
Well, then President Trump just said he's going to pull out of Syria. And I think that was maybe the trigger, if not one of the triggers, for you leaving the government. And then he said it again most recently after this famous or infamous call with the Turkish president, Mr. Erdogan. Tell me, first of all, about your general reaction to this withdrawal, and then, where do you think it'll eventually end?
Yeah, what's so screwy about it is that there's no process in the Trump administration to really make and develop policy that connects to the president.
Okay.
So the president is not routinely involved in discussions about issues, including issues with American men and women in harm's way.
Right.
So that when those issues then inevitably run into a friction point and it comes to him, that's when the policy tends to just jerk all over the place because he's has not fully internalized what the issues are.
Right.
Okay. So on Syria, I experienced this a number of times. What happened really last fall was we had a national security process that came out with a Syria policy.
Okay.
That was very ambitious. Our objectives were we are going to stay in Syria. American forces will stay in Syria until a number of goals are met. And I actually thought they might. What I teach here is presidential decision making, the importance of aligning your ends, ways, and means.
Right.
It's very dangerous when a president declares objectives that we don't have the ability, the resources, or the will to meet. I think that's how we get ourselves in trouble.
Right.
That's not just a Trump problem. That goes all the way back to Truman and others. But we came out with a very ambitious Syria policy, and then it was my job, with Secretary Mattis and others, to make sure the coalition was signed up for the next year, 2 years. And so we met with them. We met with the military contributors to the coalition in mid-December or so, and they all signed up because this was we put this together very carefully. This was a common threat to all of us. And it was about a week after that, or even less, where Trump said, no, get everybody out of Syria. And that was just kind of the final straw in terms of this.
Right.
There's only so many times you can be representing United States policy as a diplomat.
Because you're talking with your coalition
with your
partners.
Colleagues.
Right.
And have the rug completely pulled out from under you. That had happened a couple times, actually, in the Trump administration. I resigned that week, as did Secretary Mattis. They revised the policy to cut the force in Syria by about 50%. So Trump was convinced to at least revisit getting out entirely. But that already, you talk about the ends, ways, and means problem, Syria is a difficult place. And we had the mission pretty much carefully calibrated with a resource commitment that was designed to meet at least the objectives on ISIS.
Right.
And to make sure that this third of Syria that we had clawed back from ISIS remained stable, remained more or less under our influence, and deterred the worst instincts of other actors. And when you cut that force by 50%, and the whole world knows that your President Trump, wants to leave, and you're dealing with people like Putin or Assad or Khamenei or Erdogan, it dramatically increases the risk for the United States.
Right.
And that's basically what happened throughout the course of this calendar year, which then I think culminated in the second call from Erdogan, in which Trump did exactly what he did at the end of last year and said, you know what, I don't want to be there anyway. And this just created a cascading set of negative consequences.
And how does it look on the ground today? Like, who's in charge of Raqqa today, just for our listeners? Like, and where are the Kurds? Where will they go? What's happening on the border between Syria and Turkey?
So as soon as Trump on Sunday night, October 6th, issued a statement from the White House that you can only read as a green light for Erdogan to come into Syria.
Right.
And it's not just Erdogan. So people in Turkey, NATO army, first of all, since the coup, there's all sorts of problems in Turkey. But the infantry that Turkey supports are Syrian opposition groups, some of whom are very patriotic, but many of whom are of an extremist bent.
Okay.
Those are the forces that kind of began to flow into Syria after that green light from President Trump. And this just immediately began to unravel the entire security architecture of northeast Syria.
Okay.
The Russians started maneuver to our south. The Kurds started to pull off of critical objectives like guarding ISIS prisons and manning the front lines against ISIS. What ended up happening over the course of really extraordinary 10 days is U.S. forces gave up their facilities that we had across the entire periphery of the northeast. So where are we now? Raqqa, the former capital of ISIS, is now back under control of the Assad regime.
So Assad's there. His people are there.
Our major base outside of Manbij. Why is Manbij important? That was the city in which major attacks into Paris, for example, were planned, plotted, and they sent teams from there.
Okay.
We clawed it back with the SDF. Our main facilities that were in Manbij are now controlled by the Russians. The entire border region, which includes the majority Kurdish areas, majority Christian areas, there's some majority Arab areas and mixed areas. Putin and Erdogan sat down in Sochi last week. It really, if you look at the pictures, it's like you're living in 1920 or something, with a map of Syria and carved up that entire area. So you now have, and again, these were areas in which U.S. forces, very small numbers, were there as of a month ago, keeping things relatively stable. It has now been carved up by Russia and Turkey. And so in predominantly Kurdish areas like Kobani, now the Russians and the Assad regime are back. And in the center of that border region, you have a strip that has been basically annexed by the Turks. That's where we are, and U.S. forces are now consolidating in oil region. I think what this represents is enough people went to Trump to say, hey, we can't leave entirely, this is becoming a real mess, and convinced him that there are some small oil facilities. So that's something that convinced him, so now we are consolidating in that area. But as we've already basically lost the rest of northeast Syria.
Sounds very depressing, given the fight we did to push them out of there. What's your long-term prognosis for what happens with this new security architecture that's been set up by Putin, Erdogan? Where is Assad in all this, by the way? Like, he wasn't in Sochi, I noticed. I mean, those are a lot of questions. Like, both the short term, like, will this stabilize, or do you think over time they'll be back to insurgencies, and in particular help us understand what happens to the Kurds?
So when I resigned my position in December, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post. I said, look, there are 4 hard truths on the Syria policy that we need to accept now, or this is going to get even harder. And they're hard truths. I said hard truths because they're hard to accept. Number 1, Assad's not going anywhere. This has been an 8-year civil war. He's fully backed by the Russians and the Iranians, and it's his state. There is a state there. And so this is horrible, given that 500,000 people have died and you have almost 8 million people displaced. He's not going anywhere.
Right.
And the more that we try to convince ourselves otherwise, I think we actually limit our own options.
Right.
That's number 1. Number 2, Turkey, when it comes to Syria, is not a particularly reliable actor.
Right.
I kind of explained why. And I love Turkey. They're an important NATO ally. We work with them a number of things. But what we've seen from Turkey and Syria is a whole different story. I can go into this in chapter and verse, but it does not particularly surprise me that we just found Baghdadi 3 miles from the Turkish border.
That surprised me. So explain to our listeners why that was not surprising to you.
Well, northwest Syria, which is now the part of Syria that Turkey ostensibly has influence over. Okay. There are 12 Turkish military bases. It is where the Syrian opposition is. It's where there's 3 million people trapped in this very horrible situation.
Okay.
But it is controlled by al-Qaeda-affiliated extremists. It is just a hornet's nest of extremist groups. That is sustained by cross-border trade from Turkey. Some Syria analysts try to draw bright lines between this extremist group and that one, and therefore Baghdadi could never find all these groups are symbiotic. They fight from time to time, but they kind of share the same worldview.
And Turkey is creating the permissive conditions for them to be there.
Turkey looked the other way.
Right.
As tens of thousands of foreign fighters flowed through their territory.
Right.
Just in my role, a number of discussions with the Turks in 2013, 14 about, hey guys, like, what? This is a major problem. And even when we began the ISIS campaign, we were negotiating with Turkey. John Allen and I was a deputy of John Allen in the beginning of this, spent most of our time in Turkey trying to get permission to fly off of Incirlik Air Base to bomb ISIS because we're flying all the way from the Gulf. And Turkey said no. Trying to encourage the Turks to take some action on their border as ISIS fighters are flowing both ways, and Turkey did not particularly help. Trying to work with Turkey to develop forces that could actually be organized to fight ISIS in Syria, and that became something that just became impossible to do. So a number of things over the years, you started to see that something's not on the level here. Mm-hmm. And Erdogan in particular is a unique historical figure because he's a terrific politician, but he has ambitions for Turkey to pretty much extend Turkey's sovereignty beyond its borders. And you can see this in the Mediterranean in terms of his threats to areas near Cyprus, which mm-hmm. you'll hear from your Greek counterparts. Mm-hmm. Northern Iraq, there's about 20-something Turkish military bases in northern Iraq. Erdogan tried to inject Turkish forces into the Mosul campaign when that would have really upended things. We actually had to put U.S. Marines on a road to stop that.
Really?
And moving basically Turkish sovereignty 30 kilometers into Syria, you start to see an overall strategy of which our relationship with the Syrian Kurds and the YPG is a definite irritant, but is not the kind of main driver, in my view, of Erdogan's overall ambitions. And I think you have to kind of see where he is coming from. And in fact, when we started to work with the Syrian Kurds in the Battle of Kobani in the fall of 2014, and John Allen and I were in Ankara for most of that period. We actually supplied that battle through southeast Turkey. We had Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga come into Kobani. The YPG, which is the Syrian Kurdish group that the Turks have a serious problem with at the time.
Who are based in Syria. So our listeners
Syrians
can follow us, yeah.
At the time, we're like working with Turkey. They had relationships with Turkey.
Interesting.
Their political leaders were in Ankara having meetings. This got very complicated when, and this is how Turkish domestic politics kind of drive their foreign policy oftentimes. There was an election in Turkey in the summer of 2015 in which Kurdish-dominated political party did better than anticipated.
Right.
Erdogan did not meet a threshold he wanted to change his constitution. He canceled the election, re-triggered the war against the PKK, which goes up and down for 40 years, mm-hmm. and suddenly this got a lot more complicated. So a lot of this is about Turkish domestic politics, and that brings in the importance of American diplomacy. I mean, war and conflict is an outgrowth oftentimes of a failure of diplomacy.
Right.
And what I've seen in the Trump administration, and it's not the fault of the diplomats working this, is that there is not a real strategically focused diplomatic effort that is backed, as you know, if you're doing diplomacy overseas with some tough actors, you need the president at your back.
Right.
And that is just not something we have now in the American toolkit. And so I think the Turkey problem in Syria is something that you can manage diplomatically. I think it's been difficult to do that because you don't have the president backing up the diplomats.
Right.
So when Erdogan gets to Trump on the phone, everything simply goes out the window.
Is there any good news? Well, tell us what you think the future of the... Well, I want to come back to the Kurds, but also like the future of ISIS moving forward. Both of those two groups. What happens next?
Well, first, the fact that this extraordinary operation just took place against Baghdadi is...
Very impressive.
Is really great news. I mean, he will be replaced, but in many ways he's somewhat irreplaceable. He claimed, it's false, but he claimed to have unique religious credentials.
Right.
He claimed to be a caliph. He claimed to be in charge of a caliphate.
The family of Muhammad, right?
And people around the world who pledge allegiance to ISIS pledge allegiance to him. So he's a unique figure, and therefore his removal from the scene is nothing but good news.
Right.
I mean, if this had happened, say, a year and a half ago, when we were in strength in Syria, we'd be collecting all of this information, and we'd be preparing to just completely decimate the remnants and networks of ISIS. Because the information we're going to gather is truly extraordinary.
Right.
I think we've captured 2 individuals who were living with Baghdadi, the amount of information we probably got off the site. And that's why it's unfortunate, and I had not been in the post today about this, that we've basically receded from all this territory, which makes it more difficult for us to follow through and consolidate on this extraordinary
gain for
the United States. So we'll do all we can, but I think the chances for us to consolidate this, I think, have been diminished. That's unfortunate. But, on Syria, I don't really know at this point where U.S. policy is going, because I think we now have a toehold in this oil region, but that's not going to give us that much leverage over the overall situation, given the other players. If you just do a net assessment of the situation, those are pretty small oil fields. Our force, the SDF, has controlled them now for almost 2 years. And basically, the Assad regime and the Russians have really begun to consolidate their influence and control. What worries me in the Middle East is other conflicts can easily begin to spark up. I think the Iranians are probably going to do some things to poke around, which will put Trump again in a corner. Do I respond or not? So it remains a bit of a tinderbox. And we have sent 14,000 American troops to the Middle East since May, even as President Trump is saying at his political rallies that we're bringing troops home, which is not true.
Kind of incredible. It makes me think we are not done talking about Syria. Let's have you back, Brett, and we'll get an update from you later. But thank you for that tour of history, but also to remind us where we're at and what the stakes are.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Anytime.
You've been listening to World Class from the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. If you like this episode, please review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps new listeners find the show. And be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on what's happening in the world and why.